and the Consortium Coordinator. We're excited to welcome you to today's webinar, which will start with an overview of the Consortium and opportunities for member engagement. We will then have a presentation on housing and children's development by Dr. Tama Leventhal, who is the new chair of the Consortium Steering Committee, and Dr. Sandra Newman. Just a quick word before we begin about the technology we are using today. We're using GoToWebinar to host this webinar, and all of the attendees are muted. If you have questions for the speakers, please use the chat box on your screen to submit questions. Today's webinar is being recorded. After it ends, I will be uploading it to SRCD's YouTube channel and will share that link with you all. If you have colleagues or friends who were not able to make today's webinar but are interested in the content, please share the link with them. Now I would like to turn it over to our Steering Committee Vice Chair, Dr. Ihemoa Iruka, who was kind enough to pre-record this introductory segment for our webinar today. Just a moment, some technical difficulties.
Patricia, I'm going to try to share it from my screen, okay?
Thank you.
You're welcome.
And I'm very excited to be part of the Child Policy Diversity Consortium, where I'll be the vice chair beginning this year. And just to quickly give you a quick bio about me, I've been in Nebraska for 2 years, so the big transition for me still. And I come by way of the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill at the Puerto Rico Child Development Institute. And most notably focuses on both micro processes such as parent-child interaction, classroom quality, as well as macro issues including early childhood systems, but also issues really around racial equity, juvenile code for Black boys, as well as looking at how we can ensure that systems and policies really are addressing the needs of young children, particularly those in poverty and ethnically and religiously minority children. So I'm very excited to be part of this consortium that's a part of for a little while. And so really look forward to working with the leadership and especially the staff moving this forward. So my job is to really give a consortium overview and key efforts. And so this is a pre-recorded tape because either I've already given birth or literally moments ago given birth. So sorry I cannot be there live, but I really do hope that this pre-taped session would work just as well as if I was in person. But I do look forward to our continued work together over time. So who is the consortium? So it's really a national interdisciplinary organization of university-based entities that really focus on child and family policies, really broadly defined. And the members of the consortium are really multifaceted, from institutes, centers, programs, departments, to just list a few. And they're varying sizes of affiliated faculty, staff, students, members, etc., in the areas of psychology, public health, health, education, economics. So really the intention is really to be interdisciplinary with university-based organizations. So the consortium is organized in the intentional form that's fostering research, which is really in terms of sharing the latest findings and strategies, for really conducting policy-relevant research and facilitation of that scientific collaboration, really between researchers and policymakers. Another area covers around careers. So really across the efforts at the undergraduate and graduate faculty levels to support the next generation of child and family experts as they pursue both their academic and professional pursuits. And then the other area that the consortium fosters of engagement is really trying to effectively translate research policy and practice, to really bringing together experts in this arena to really delve deeper in terms of how does research and practice and policy really connect together in this sort of bi-directional feedback loop. So it really not just about doing research for the sake of it, but also doing research with the intention of really impacting policy as well as practice. So just to give you a general overview of sort of the consortium's development and growth. So it's founded in 2002, and so from 2002 to 2007, 4 all-member meetings were held, and then eventually these were all was administered at Georgetown University. And so between 2008 to 2009, the administration moved from Georgetown to Duke, and there was a one-day-a-week director appointed. The website was launched, and it was still the consortium co-led SRCD pre-conference. And then in 2010, interest groups formed, met regularly by conference call. The website was further enhanced, and then it was a parent roundtable. So you can kind of see just in terms of how the consortium went from just being a few meetings to really becoming much more engaged in terms of the scholarly and research and policy and practice work. So in 2011, there were guest speakers via webinars, interest group coaches were established, just early childhood, for example, developed partnerships with 18 Division 37, focus on families, create a newsletter, and then co-led the second SRCD pre-conference. And this sort of work continued to 2012, where we established a much more formal early childhood working group, continuing to expand the membership, and then expand out to the steering committee. In 2013, there was a launching of the Child Welfare and Education Community through OMT Grant Foundation funded work, and then also initiated international child policy with Dr. John Lombardi, who we know is a very well-known early childhood development expert. And then also co-led the third SRCD pre-conference. And in 2014, just a couple of years ago, the administration moved to SRCD, the Society for Research and Child Development from Duke University. And so the committee, the steering committee at this point in terms of the consortium, now consists of 8 people from across the country and elected individuals from member institutions. And we are thankfully staffed by really some fantastic people that's part-time, but I imagine it's really a full-time job, by Patricia Burton, who's the coordinator, and of course Marty Dazzle, our senior advisor, and the Hannah Klein, who's the assistant. Again, they do such phenomenal work, so I can't imagine it's only part-time. And just to give you a sense of the webinar speakers or topics we had in 2015 and 2016, you can kind of see the gamut on the screen. There were webinars on expulsion and suspension policy led by Walter Gilliam. There were discussions about better state expenditures on children by Heather Hahn and by Steve Barnett. As you can kind of see, a lot of the webinars are trying to really be aligned with things that are happening in the country. Other series on how to become a better policy researcher were Rachel Childs and Cohen and Elizabeth Gershoff, and the things around the impact of terrorism on children by James Savarino and others. And then the issue of, can you tell me how to get to Philly Street from the county jail by Rebecca Schaffer in Collinsville, University of Minnesota. So you can see the diversity of webinar speakers and topics. And also know that if any of these sound interesting to you, that you can find them on SRCD's YouTube channel. So for the 2016-2017 webinar series, we are looking into topics such as universal home visiting, community police and civil unrest, extrajudicial violence, how to write and disseminate the non-academic audiences, and many, many much more. So stay tuned for those dates for more information. But again, we selected a lot of these webinar series from you guys to hope as you think of the work that you're engaged in or interested in, that you can share that with us, and we will definitely try to make that happen. So we really encourage participation at all levels, regardless of where you are, from faculty to students to staff to scientists. So we really want people to feel that this is their consortium and that they're getting something really important out of it, whether you're a policymaker on one end or focus on policy issues or researcher based science. We're really trying to make sure that we connect the work of research, policy, and practice really much, especially our children and families, much more clearly and succinctly. So we really encourage all participation. So what are the membership benefits for students? We see it as an event to identify possible mentors who conduct policy rather than working in the field, to assist consortium projects and initiatives, such as writing a newsletter, planning webinars, and these are all just great networking and exposure. And also just to connect students at other consortium member entities. So for students, it's such a great way to get additional mentoring and additional exposure to many things around research and policy. Well, what are the membership benefits for the faculty of research scientists? I would say that there's so many, and so these bullets just list a smattering of them. It's a way, obviously, to identify and connect with policy and practice researchers in the field and across disciplines, to learn from experts about how to effectively communicate research to policymakers and practitioners, and really to share lessons learned with peers who are either struggling with similar things such as how to write approach by state legislatures, learn about other career opportunities, and then just discuss the challenges of being a policy researcher and how to do that in your academic institutions, since we know the work of policy researchers is different than just basic science researchers. And I should add that I was actually able to connect with my great friends and colleagues who we call Fraud League through this consortium, and we've written many papers and books together. So I consider that I represent the benefit of this consortium in many, many ways, and I'm so grateful that I was part of it, and I'm so part of it. And so what additional consortium benefits and resources? The meetings and conferences attended by consortium members, their website resources in terms of upcoming references, policy relevant grades and reports, syllabi for class at universities nationwide, archive of webinars and newsletters, so many other things. So you can just join the listserv, and you will receive a lot of information from postings that are open, conference submissions, and just many relevant events, as well as internship and other opportunities. So there's a lot that the consortium members get out of just being part of the consortium. So just again, you'll probably get this PowerPoint, so just to highlight some of the recent accomplishments of the consortium. And of course, we love, because I think it's important to acknowledge the work that has gone on and how we're from 2002 to 2016. So of course, established a collaboration with SRCD, who now manages the consortium. And since that pilot period, this collaboration became permanent just last December. So we held elections, we elected a new steering committee chair and a vice chair, and myself. We've conducted member surveys, recruited 3 student columnists, and held webinar series, especially with to highlight obviously Dr. Joe Lombardi. We have also expanded the website to include publications, including opportunities, other relevant announcements. Increased the membership, which I think is really important. And it also hosted calls with the National Conference of State Legislatures and the National Conference Association, really important policy organizations. So what are our current consortium efforts? So we're planning for the 2016-2017 webinar, and we've already put out a poll on the list for members of the consortium to vote on which topics were of particular interest to them. And then the consortium website will be transitioned to a new platform over the next several months, so keep an eye out for the new look and new content. And of course, we'll take any comments that you may have about, oh, this is fabulous, especially the ones that are fabulous. And of course, if there's any budgets or issues, we'll also have to hear about that. And now, subcommittee is working to plan for the 2017 Singular Pre-Conference that we held on April 5th, 2017 in Austin, Texas. So the consortium is growing and is evolving to best meet members' needs. So again, I encourage you to feel like it is your consortium and that you want to get the most out of it, regardless of your faculty or student or staff. And so please, please feel free to share any thoughts you have, any suggestions to really make this work the way we want it to work. So these are kind of members. I won't, list anybody out particularly, but just take a second to look at who's there, is your university there, is there particularly interested in even connecting with, even though that they connected through the CFP Consortium, etc. If you're not there, hopefully you're thinking about being there. So we employ you to get involved, join the consortium listserv, join our upcoming webinar, become a member, and you connect with Patricia Barton, and her email's right there for more details, as well as visit the consortium website at www.childpolicyuniversityconsortium.com.
All right, Patricia, I'll turn it over to you so that you can introduce Tama.
Of course. Thank you again to Ihemoa for recording that segment for our webinar today, and so sorry about those technical difficulties earlier. I'd now like to turn it over to Tama Leventhal, who is the chair of the Consortium Steering Committee and who will be presenting on research and policy considerations related to housing and children's development. Hold on one second.
Tama, let's check your audio.
Is this better?
That's much better. Great, now we can hear you.
Should I start again?
Yes, would you mind?
No, I do not. Okay. Is the screen in the correct view mode?
Yes. We can also,
Okay.
if we could try to do a full screen,
Okay.
if possible.
That would be good.
I feel like I'm going to, when I try to do that, I'm going to make people see me.
If you click on slideshow up on the upper...
Oh, slideshow. Okay, yes. Oh, just the regular from current. Okay, yes.
Yep.
I'm sorry about that, everyone. What you didn't hear when I was on mute was that this is my first webinar, so you'll have to bear with me. And of course, an obvious thing to do would be to thank Patricia, Hannah, and Marty for organizing the webinar and putting up with me and my inexperience, and of course, Ihemoa and her absentia for her doing the introductions. Before I begin, I just, of course, want to acknowledge the funders of the research I'm going to be presenting today, MacArthur Foundation, William T. Grant, and the Annie E. Casey Foundation. Before I give a brief overview of what I want to talk about, I do want to start with the preface that housing is defined in a variety of ways. My own field of child development typically thinks about housing with regard to the quantity and quality of stimulation in the home, particularly around parent-child interactions. From a public health perspective, the focus is typically on things like the physical and environmental features of the home, lead being a very obvious example. Housing policy is usually most concerned with the dwelling unit as being adequate and affordable in terms of a place to live. Economists usually emphasize the financial costs and investment of housing and its relation to broader market conditions. Sociologists might think about housing, typically think about housing with regard to the household's composition in terms of who lives in the home and their connections to the surrounding community. I want to say that all of these perspectives have informed my understanding of housing and its relation to children's development. For purposes of the presentation today, I want to define housing with regard to thinking about the housing unit, which probably most closely aligns with the housing policy perspective. For today's talk, I want to start by giving a brief overview of housing and children's development, particularly what we know. Then I want to focus on 4 areas and what I'm saying where we need to know more, and some work that I've done in each of these areas. And then I'll end with some brief implications for research and policy. I know the topic of implications for research will be picked up in more detail by our discussant, Sandra Newman. So with that, hello? To organize the presentation, I've proposed a number of questions, and that's really because unless we can answer some fundamental questions about whether and how housing influences children's development, I think policy efforts at altering families' housing may be in vain. This figure identifies 6 housing features that we've identified as being central to housing policy and theoretically relevant to children's development. The first is the physical housing quality, and here we can think about things like environmental hazards and structural and maintenance deficiencies, crowding, which is typically defined as the ratio of persons to rooms, residential mobility, which is most of you are probably familiar with, home ownership, which is usually looked at with respect to whether one owns or rents their home, subsidized housing, which is the receipt of various forms of government assistance with housing, covering the cost of housing, and unaffordability, which is the most common definition is when a family spends 30% or more of their income on housing. As the figure that I'm showing here depicts, I'm going to start by talking about the direct effects of the housing unit on children's development. And housing features are likely to influence a range of children's outcomes, from their cognitive and achievement outcomes to physical health and their social and emotional functioning. So to figure out what we already know, my colleague Sandra Newman, who's going to be our discussant, and I conducted a review of the research that had been published in the past 25 years. And we did this review a few years ago. In our review, we focused primarily on quantitative studies, and we had a number of other criteria in which we used to determine which studies would make it into the review, and I won't go into those details here. And we considered the 6 housing features which I just discussed. And what we learned from this review was several important things. First, with regard to quality, poor air quality, including exposures to things like allergens and mold, was most related to respiratory conditions. And lead paint, which is something people are hearing a lot about these days, was, there was a strong connection to children's cognition. The crowding conditions are associated with poor physical health, and this is often thought to be related to the spread of infection that can occur within close living quarters. And there's possibly some association between crowding and children's educational outcomes. The work on mobility suggested that there's some short-term associations between residential mobility and children's achievement and functioning. The long-term research suggests that there's predominantly harmful effects on children's educational attainment. In the area of home ownership, there's some consistent evidence that home ownership has beneficial effects for a range of child and family outcomes. But there's some serious questions that remain about self-selection, and that's whether it's ownership per se or unmeasured characteristics of homeowners that promotes children's achievement. With regard to subsidized housing, there was some suggestive evidence here with regard to connections to children's achievement, but the research here was fairly limited. This work indicated that public housing may have some benefits for children's educational outcomes, and receipt of housing vouchers in the one experimental trial that's been done, welfare to work voucher demonstration, there were really very few effects on children's outcomes. Again, in the area of affordability, there has not been as much work here, but the work that has been done suggests that the benefits of high-priced housing markets may actually outweigh some of the potential costs to families in terms of spending more money on housing in the area of their children's schooling outcomes. So overall, just to summarize, what we found was that the strongest and most convincing evidence here was really provided for the relationship between housing quality and crowding with children's development. In our review, we found several shortcomings of the existing research that surfaced with regard to understanding the link between children's development and housing. And so in ongoing work that I've been doing with my colleagues and students, we've been trying to address some of these issues. The focus of today's talk is largely going to be on conceptual questions, but in the work that we've been doing, we've certainly been taking into account some of the methodological challenges that we identified. So I've labeled these issues what we need to know. I'm going to start with the first question where we need to know more, and I think this question follows most closely from the review I just presented, and that is which housing features matter most. So the first issue I'll discuss is that which of the housing features that have been studied matter most for children in terms of their relative contributions to children's outcomes, as well as for which specific outcomes that might matter most. And these gaps exist because most of the studies that were done really looked at only one or two housing features in isolation, and many studies only explored a single outcome. So here I just want to summarize the results of a study that I did with Rebecca Levine-Coley, who's also is on the consortium as a steering committee member, and we did this with several of our students and postdocs that tried to address this issue of which housing features matter most. I'm only going to cover the methods very briefly. We used a representative sample of children and adolescents from low-income families who were sampled from low-income neighborhoods in 3 cities. For those of you familiar, this was a 3-city study of welfare children and families. We considered 5 housing features, which are listed here: quality, mobility, ownership, assistance, and affordability. And we looked at these simultaneously. We did not have a good measure in this study of crowding. All of our measures of housing were, with the exception of quality, were based strictly on mother report. The measure that we used of housing quality was a combination of mother report and interviewer observations that largely tapped structural and maintenance deficiencies in the home. We also explored a range of outcomes, including standardized achievement tests, and we had a comprehensive assessment of children's social and emotional functioning. And then finally, I'd add that we used more rigorous analytic methods that have been used in previous research. We analyzed both within-person and between-person links between housing and children's development, and we had an extensive battery of background characteristics that we included as covariates. And what these results indicated was, when we looked at these housing features, that housing quality was the most consistently associated with children's development. And it was low-quality housing that impaired children and adolescents' emotional and behavioral functioning, as well as adolescents' achievement. Now I want to turn to another area where there important questions remain, and that is when housing matters most. And this issue was something that we addressed to some extent in the previous study that I talked about, but it was not the main focus. So included in this version of the original figure is a new blue box where we acknowledge the fact that the role of housing may shift over the course of development. And in this study, you'll also note from the figure that the focus is on residential mobility. So mobility, I'm not going to give a lot of detail, but it is a very common experience for children in the U.S., and it's especially common for younger children as compared with adolescents. And as I discussed from our review, I think now that maybe I actually skipped over residential mobility. Residential mobility, especially multiple moves, has generally been found to be detrimental to children's development. And there's good reason to think that residential mobility may have unique consequences in either childhood and or adolescence. The prevailing wisdom is that mobility is generally most harmful to adolescents, and that's because moving disrupts peer networks, and peers are particularly important during adolescence. It's also likely that moving may be disrupted during childhood because the family is the primary context of development, and the instability created by moving in the family context could have both short and long-term implications for children's development. There's also another possibility that a lot of research has not considered, and that it might be moving across both childhood in adolescence that's most detrimental. We refer to this as serial mobility. And that's because moving across both developmental periods could have compounding consequences for child well-being beyond any potential developmental sensitivities. And this is an issue that's not really addressed in a lot of research on mobility in adolescent development, but it's very important for disentangling whether mobility in adolescence really matters in terms of thinking about prior mobility histories. Any study of residential mobility, especially one that wants to try and move the field forward, which is hopefully the intent of some of this work, needs to acknowledge and address the serious selection problems that arise in studying residential mobility. And that's that families move for a variety of reasons, divorce or employment being examples. And mobile families also may have unique characteristics. For example, very low-income families may move more than more advantaged families. And it may be these unique characteristics and attributes that really differentiate mobile and stable families. Many studies have addressed this issue in a very limited manner, and work that Sandy Newman and I have been doing with both current and former students of ours, notably Sarah Anderson and Phil Garrodin. We have been trying to address some of these issues and thinking about them and moving the field forward and how to address them. So now I'd like to discuss a study that I did with Sarah Anderson that focused on this issue of when housing matters. And in this study, we also tried to tackle this selection problem. For this study, we used data on a diverse sample of children from a multi-site study, the NICHD study of early child care and youth development. It's important to note that this sample is more advantaged than a nationally representative sample. And children and families were followed intensively and extensively from birth through age 15. Although our primary focus was on the timing of mobility, we also considered the extent of mobility, and I'll address how we handled that next. We examined mobility across childhood and then again across both childhood and adolescence, what we're referring to as serial mobility. The outcomes that we examined were to the ones I talked about in the previous study in terms of achievement and behavior problems. And then to deal with the selection problem I described, we used propensity score methods, and I'll just say what they are in brief for those of you who are unfamiliar with them. These methods attempt to mimic an experiment by comparing individuals who are similar on observed baseline characteristics, that is, trying to compare mobile and stable youth with similar profiles. This study that I use, the NICHD study of early child care and youth development, is particularly well suited to this approach because we have extensive child, family, and neighborhood data on these children that enable us to match mover and stable children. And for those of you who are familiar with propensity score methods, we used a weighting approach for this study. The next slide presents the different mobility categories, and here I've broken it out by time and extent of mobility. You'll see that about 20% of children never moved, and this is the group that will serve as our comparison or referent group. About half of the sample moved in childhood, about one quarter moving only one time, and a somewhat larger number moving at least 2 times. About a quarter of children fall into this serial mobility category, and similar to the childhood mobility, you see that more children were in the high versus low category. A really interesting and surprising finding was that only a very small percentage of children in this sample moved only in adolescence. And in fact, it was such a small group that we could not examine this group separately in our subsequent analysis. And I think this finding has very important implications for studies that look at mobility in adolescence and the extent to which we may be underestimating or misrepresenting mobility by not factoring in prior mobility histories. So using more conservative analytic methods and trying to parse out childhood and adolescent and serial mobility yielded findings that were consistent with previous studies in some ways but not others. And what we found was that only serial mobility at high levels was associated with children's internalizing problems compared with peers who were stable. The findings for externalizing behavior were marginal in nature. In terms of the conceptual issues that I talked about, the findings suggest that it's probably cumulative experiences that may be more important than any potential developmental sensitivities. And it's like in our descriptive analysis that we did, we found that children who fell into the high serial mobility category were a particularly disadvantaged group in many respects. So it's likely that moving multiple times across childhood and adolescence probably just compounded the developmental risks that these children already faced. I think it's also worth pointing out that the magnitude of the effect of moving of serial mobility was quite small, and so we might want to think about that with regard to policy. I don't know if our findings warrant major policy interventions given the relatively small magnitude of effects, or at least serial mobility, accounting for all of these selection factors. The next area that I want to explore where knowledge is lacking is for whom housing matters most. In addressing this issue of for whom housing matters most, I have the same figure, and here again I want to point your attention to the blue box where gender appears. This study also focuses on housing quality, in part because of the previous findings that I discussed, highlighting its salience. Much less work has focused on the housing context as opposed to the neighborhood context, and you'll see here that we're also looking at neighborhood disorder. These two contexts are inextricably related, and in the case of low-income families, which is the population that I'll be talking about, these families often have to trade one context off of the other. So here we consider, it's also important as we think about from a developmental perspective, the salience of these contexts may shift over the course of adolescence, as adolescents are granted more autonomy and spend more time out of the home. But exposure to these contexts could occur in very gender-specific ways. And so there's several lines of research that really suggest that boys may have greater exposure to the neighborhood context than girls. And this may function in part through parental monitoring, with parents exerting greater control over girls' activities than boys. Other related works on leisure patterns of adolescence suggest that girls' activities often are anchored more in the home, and boys' activities may be anchored more in the neighborhood and with peers. I should note in this study, I won't be talking about the findings, but we did look at parenting as well. So this study also used data from the 3-city study, which is the study I talked about for the first example of multiple housing features. Here our study used multi-level modeling because the adolescents in our sample were nested within neighborhoods. And what we found, somewhat as expected, was that housing problems were related to adolescent girls' suppressive symptoms, whereas neighborhood disorder was more related to boys' symptoms. And this pattern replicated for girls for some other symptoms. Interestingly, we did not find that neighborhood disorder was related to adolescent boys' delinquency in this study. And the results for the parenting analysis that I mentioned earlier suggest that these differential gender patterns probably are related to contextual exposure and differential parental monitoring. The final issue that I want to address and that I just touched upon a little bit was how housing matters for children's development. And in this figure, I lay out one potential pathway or indirect route, and that is family processes. Family processes likely play a central role in linking housing to children's development. And here, to think about the role of family processes, the work that we've done draws a lot on theories of family resources to connect housing and children's development. Housing conditions such as poor quality may cause greater family instability, both in terms of daily routines, but also more generally in terms of decisions to move. And that could be harmful to children's development. Housing conditions can also be a source of stress for families if we think about crowding or, again, poor quality. The stress created by problematic housing may undermine parenting and compromise children's development. There's very few studies that have been done on this indirect pathways between indirect pathways between housing and children's development, but this information is really critical for informing policy and practice. So I want to follow up on the example from the first study that I talked about, where we looked at which housing features matter most. And in this study, we also tackled this final question in terms of how housing matters for children's development. We looked at how family processes related to stability and stress, which I just talked about. might be a pathway between housing quality and children's emotional and behavior problems. We looked at parental psychological distress, more general parenting stress, as well as family routines related to regular bedtimes and meal times, so getting at stability. And what we found was that housing quality does function in part via parental distress, and family stress. So the results were more in line with conceptual models related to family stress rather than stability. So now I want to conclude with just some very brief implications through research and policy. The starting point for the research that I presented today was to focus on policy relevant features and to ask the types of questions that one needs to know to inform policy and practice. So in terms of implications for research, I think the first one is that we obviously need to keep working to build better theories about how housing is related both directly and indirectly to children's development. And hopefully the studies I presented today are an initial attempt to move in that direction. In a similar vein, I think we need to increase the rigor of the research to have confidence in findings that they're going to serve as a basis for policy. And this includes things like using more robust analytic methods, using better study designs and better measures of housing, particularly as related to children's development. I know this is a topic that Sandy Newman's going to address more in the discussion, so I'll leave it there. And then just some few very brief policy implications. The review of the literature that we did, as well as the work that I presented today, suggests that housing quality is an important, particularly when we think about quality beyond things like environmental toxins, is an important but overlooked feature of housing that's relevant to child and family well-being. And if we wanted to target policy efforts, we might also think about families who have high levels of mobility over time as being a group that warrants some attention. So I think with that, I will pass on to our discussant.
Hi, this is Sandy. Am I being heard?
Yeah, yes.
Okay, terrific. Thanks very, very much. Thanks to Tama for this invitation, and to all of you for organizing this, and for the listeners who are on the line. I hope Tama doesn't mind. I'm going to add one update on the work on housing affordability, which is actually a topic that I focus on a great deal, and there are new findings on affordability that are actually very exciting. And that is that the rule of thumb for what is considered an affordable housing unit is roughly 30% of a family's income. And this rule of thumb is used both in government programs and also by loan officers at banks and throughout the economy. In recent work that we have done, we have found that affordability has an effect on children's cognitive achievement. That is that families who are living in affordable housing, their children achieve greater cognitive outcomes than families that are not in affordable housing. And we then took the next step to try to understand what the mechanism might be there by looking at the consumer expenditure surveys. And I don't recommend this to anyone. It's a really very difficult data set to work with. But what we were able to learn from the CEX is that families in the affordable circumstance were actually spending more on children's enrichment than families who were not living in affordable housing. And affordability in two different data sets, the panel study of income dynamics and in the consumer expenditure survey, is right around the 30% of income mark. So that's actually a fairly remarkable consistent result across databases, and the 30% standard, I won't go into detail, but it is not based on empirical evidence. So this is actually the first bit of empirical evidence, at least with respect to children's cognitive achievement. So just wanted to put in a plug for this new work. As Tama said, I mean, there is, and much of it that she and her colleagues have done, there's a growing body of evidence about housing, but the truth of the matter is that we lack really detailed housing data in rich longitudinal surveys such as the Panel Study of Income Dynamics or the National Longitudinal Surveys of Youth, and I'm sure you all know of other surveys where there just isn't very much housing data. On the other hand, the nation's best database on housing, the National American Housing Survey, does not have very much child and family data, nor is it a longitudinal survey that follows individuals. It follows housing units. A third problem is that we don't really have housing measures that have been tested from the perspective of child well-being. I mean, we now know something more about housing affordability from a child well-being standpoint, but across the board, the measures that we use are based on code standards or, health and safety in general, not specific to children. And finally, we, other than the Moving to Opportunity demonstration and experiment and the welfare to work vouchers, as Tama mentioned, we're really lacking experimental evidence. And so what we and a number of our colleagues are now engaged in is a new study and a new data collection to try to address several of these weaknesses and with a specific focus on housing. And in this study, housing is defined broadly to include the child's residential setting, the dwelling unit and the neighborhood, as well as school quality, and then extending into the social context of the family. The name of the study is the Housing and Children's Healthy Development Study. And we are specifically interested in this study in looking at the housing options that are faced by low-income families, how these families make choices about where to live, what constraints they face, and how these constraints operate to direct their choices in one way or another, and how those choices affect the outcomes for children cognitively, socially, emotionally, and in terms of their health. The design of the study is very exciting. It is a two-part sample. The first sample is an experimental sample built off of the housing voucher program. We will be working with public housing authorities that randomize their housing vouchers so that we can get a random set of samples of treatment and control families. These will be families who have at least one child between the ages of 3 and 10. And then we will also have a second sample that is a probability sample. We refer to it as the population sample. This will be somewhat of a cross-section of families with at least one child, 3 to 10, in the same metropolitan area as the voucher experiment. We are looking at many different aspects of the child's life and residential setting. A few of the unique features of the study include, number one, these will be personal interviews, which is very expensive and actually very important in this context. Tama has designed a child time diary, which will look at how children use their time in the during the week as well as weekdays. We'll have our interviewers use an electronic laser tape measure to measure the square footage in the home. This will allow us to look at this notion of crowding and privacy in much greater detail. I know there are some standard quote-unquote measures that look at clutter in the home, and it is very important to understand what the living space in the home is when one looks at the extent of clutter and housekeeping and other things. We will also be doing pinpricks, that is collecting blood from both the primary caregiver as well as from the child, and of course these are all covered by very rigorous consent forms, with the goal of looking at both stress hormones as well as heavy metals. The study is going into a pilot, a big pilot in October, November, part of December. And based on that pilot, we will be adjusting as necessary. And then we go into the field with Wave 1 at the end of May of 2017. At present, we will be doing 2 waves of data collection. The first wave will take us about 12 months to complete. We'll then have a pause of about 12 months and then back in the field for Wave 2. And so I'm happy to answer any questions about the study, but that's the broad outlines. And I do want to acknowledge this study was developed by a fairly large interdisciplinary group of researchers. We were part of the MacArthur network, and at this point I'm now the principal investigator of the study and Tama is the co-PI.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Sandy, and thank you, Tama. This is Hannah, and I want to remind all of the participants on the webinar that if you would like to submit questions to either of our speakers, you can do so using the question box on your screen. And in the meantime, I want to get started with some of the questions we have already received. And one that came in, Sandy, while you were speaking, really struck me that this would sort of relate well to how we had ended. So I wanted to start there. And the question is, are there any high-quality data sets that focus on housing quality, specifically the environmental conditions, that you would recommend?
I'm not quite sure what environmental conditions mean, but there is no data set, for example, that is available, a public use data set that's available that includes measures, for example, of lead or of pollution or those sorts of things. There is a very extensive Healthy Homes group at HUD, and I think it's now maybe its own 501c3, I'm not sure. But they do data collection. I'm just not sure that their data are publicly available. Within the American Housing Survey itself, there's probably 100 different measures of housing, but and certainly of peeling paint and other things. But they do not ask questions about lead paint for obvious reasons. The respondent would really not be able to answer that. They do ask from time to time, not continuously, about neighborhood conditions. So that's pretty much what's available. At one time, the Environmental Protection Agency did a housing-based survey. I haven't looked into that in a long time, so the caller might want to check EPA as well.
Excellent. Thank you so much. We will direct the next question to Tama. We had received a question earlier, Tama, that asks, which mechanisms explain the link between household crowding and child development?
Thank you, Hannah. And thank you, Sandy, very much for that excellent discussion and to raising some new issues in the field. I think the last area that I talked about addressed some of these questions. And we have thought more about the various indirect ways in which housing, including crowding, might be related to children's development, and specifically with regard to crowding, which is one can think about as causing lack of personal space and chaos in a home just because of overcrowded conditions. Of the two processes that I talked about, stability and stress, I think stress would be a high probability, both direct stress on the child from chaotic conditions. Another area that we've thought a little bit about in the study that Sandy described is the role that noise may play in children's development, and that being an aspect of housing quality. But you can think about a crowded home with lots of people being more noisy, and how that might affect things like sleep. So there's ways in which we can think housing crowding would directly affect children, but how all of these aspects of crowding might also indirectly affect children, again, through the family and by creating impairing parental well-being, which will compromise effective parenting and ultimately children. Crowded conditions, probably it's harder to maintain stable routines within the home, so we can think about how crowded conditions might create more unstable conditions for the child. as well as the lack of support a child may receive in a home that is crowded and with parents who are less effective in their role, in their parenting role.
Excellent, thank you. Both of you, Tama and Sandy, spoke a little bit about the limitations of the data sets available, and we just received a question that asks, is there a work group on improving measurement of housing that you know of?
Not that I'm aware of. There certainly from time to time when the HUD works with the Census Bureau to to design and field the American Housing Survey, and from time to time they do have a thinkers group get together to talk about new modules for the American Housing Survey or adjustments, and I will say that those discussions do lead to modification in the American Housing Survey. So that's one that I know of. I am not aware of any other, groups that get together to talk about housing measurement.
Well, the former network that we were a part of spent a lot of time thinking about aspects of housing that would be relevant to children's development, and those discussions led to a lot of the innovative measures that we've included in our project, the Housing and Children's Healthy Development Study, but it's not an ongoing group at this point.
Right. So we held thinker sessions. We did all sorts of things to make sure that we had the best thinking at the table and to inform how we were going to design this. It is very challenging, but we have to start somewhere.
Okay, great. I think we have time for maybe one or two more questions. So here's another one that I can pose to both of you. Does any research examine the influence of both individual housing unit as well as neighborhood characteristics simultaneously?
Do you want me to start, Sandy, or would you like to go?
Yes, you should start. That's fine.
Really, at the most basic level, most of the work that we've been doing that looks at housing, at least, accounts for neighborhood characteristics, even if it's just as a covariate. So we want to acknowledge, as Sandy said, that this is really a bundle, and that one could account for the other if you don't connection between the two of them. The study that I talked about with regard to gender differences really looked at those two contexts and how they were related to children's development differentially by gender. Other work that we've done on mobility has looked in trying to unpack residential mobility. This is work that Sandy and I did that was led by Sarah Anderson, who was a former student of mine now at West Virginia as an assistant professor. And she tried to look at when families move, what are the contextual correlates of moving? So how does the neighborhood change? How does the family context change? How does the school and the peer context change? And in that study, for example, we found that the neighborhood characteristics actually don't change that much when most families move, because most families are moving between relatively similar neighborhoods. When families move and you get the biggest jump in neighborhoods, it tends to be when children are younger and they're moving, if they can for obvious reasons, to neighborhoods where they're thinking about things like schools, and so they might move to make a bigger jump in the type of neighborhood in terms of socio-demographic characteristics at that point in time. Sandy, did you want to add anything else?
Yeah. So both the Moving to Opportunity database and the Welfare to Work voucher database include measures of the housing unit and include measures of the neighborhood, often linked by geocodes to census tract measures, sometimes through observations. And the studies emerging from both MTO and from the Welfare to Work voucher have analyses that include both housing and neighborhood. So I think that might be a place to start. The issue with the Welfare to Work voucher, Tama mentioned it earlier, the work that they did on child healthy development outcomes was fairly limited. It was they collected those measures on a limited sample, so it was it was a little bit weaker than the rest of the study, but it's a very, very well-designed study. You might look at the papers emerging from both of those.
Excellent, thank you. And we just received one last question, and I'll have this be our last one. The question asks, what role do you think culture plays? And the question notes that not all cultures would consider large families living together to be a problem, and that perception may be a role, may play a role.
Right, I completely endorse that position, and we know from much research that's been done that in particular cultures having a large family living together in a fairly small space is actually valued. And I can't even put my finger on it, but I've actually written about this some in the past. In order to address that, we actually are measuring this kind of unmeasurable notion of crowding in a whole variety of ways in the Housing and Children's Healthy Development study. So we'll do the traditional counts of rooms and people and ages and sexes of all the children and adults. But we're then going to, we're collecting a lot of information on privacy-related issues so that we can see whether any, quantitative crowding actually has is consistent with or correlated with these measures of privacy. That is, do you have enough space to do a number of tasks without being distracted? Do people, get on each other's nerves? How do you rate the amount of space per person? Do you have enough space for all your things? Things that get at the different aspects of a negative aspect of crowding. And in part, the motivation there was to get at exactly what the caller is concerned about.
The one thing I would add, which doesn't quite get at the cultural argument, but maybe reinforces that maybe it's not as detrimental, is some of the work that we've done where, as a follow-up, we've kind of looked at who's in the home, and it turns out that when it's non-familial adults in the home, that's what seems to be more problematic. You have more people and they're not family members, which makes sense.
Okay, thank you so much. Patricia, would you like to have a chance to wrap up?
Yes, thank you so much to everyone who joined us today, and especially a huge thank you to our speakers for their presentations and to everyone for their great questions this afternoon. If you liked today's call, you may be interested in future consortiums. This is the first webinar for the 2016-2017 academic year, so keep an eye on the consortium listserv for announcements about upcoming webinars. You can, if you're not already on the consortium listserv, I would encourage you to join. You will get notifications about future webinars, our quarterly newsletter, as well as things like job postings and event announcements. I will be sending a follow-up email to all participants today, and I'll attach a copy of today's slides. I will also include a link to today's recorded webinar, which will be posted on SRCD's YouTube channel. Thank you again to everyone who joined us this afternoon, and have a great rest of your day.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Tama. Thank you, Sandy.
Thank you.